Hi, everyone. My name is Vita Golod, and I am co-founder of the Ukrainian platform for contemporary China, and currently visiting adjunct instructor at UNC, University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. Just a quick reminder, we launched this platform in 2022, just a few months after Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine, with the goal of fostering international dialogue between Ukraine and China and international experts on Ukraine's foreign policy, China's foreign policy, Sino-Ukrainian relations, along with related global issues. I am deeply grateful to today's panelists for joining us for this timely and important conversation on the recently signed mineral deal between Ukraine and the United States. My sincere thanks also go to Kaiser for his ongoing support. And I'm especially pleased to announce that this event, along with the next three in the series, is supported by the Center for Slavic, Eurasian, and East European Studies at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. It's exciting to note that the key takeaways from these discussions will be directly incorporated into an educational course offered here at UNC. That's especially meaningful because what Kaiser does with the Sinica podcast and what we do through this Ukrainian platform are grounded in real, practical conversations, discussions students simply won't hear on Fox News or other media platform. So once again, I encourage you to follow both of these projects. We are committed to exploring critical global issues through international dialogue, bringing together voices from across regions, perspectives, and disciplines. Thank you, and enjoy the conversation today. The
Thank
floor is
you.
yours.
Thank you very much, Vita. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you happen to be joining from. I am Kaiser, host of the Sinica podcast. I'm very honored to be moderating today's conversation on critical minerals and the emerging geopolitics of resource security, with a special focus on the evolving US-Ukraine mineral security partnership. Thank you so much, Vita, for once again organizing such a timely and very topical conversation, and for entrusting me with moderation duties. We are meeting at a time when global alignments are very much in flux, when stakes could not be higher. I am sure all of us remember too clearly that when President Zelensky traveled to Washington with the intention of signing the agreement that we're going to be talking about, that ended, of course, in what many people saw as a rather unbecoming spectacle in the Oval Office. It was eventually signed 3 weeks ago on May 1st. Just this week, a much anticipated phone call between Presidents Trump and Putin offered, well, depending on one's vantage point, either the tentative outline of a diplomatic path or, as I am inclined to fear, further evidence of Washington's drift toward a permissive stance on an ongoing war of naked territorial aggression. While the Kremlin has thus far resisted calls for an immediate ceasefire, the message from Kyiv and its partners remains very clear. Any durable peace must begin with the defense of sovereignty, not its erosion. Amid these shifting sands, critical minerals have become a strategic fault line, a lever of influence, a point of vulnerability, and increasingly a test of national alignment. For Ukraine, partnering with the US in securing and supplying these resources is more than just industrial policy. It's an economic lifeline. It's a strategic assertion. It's a political signal, all rolled up into one. Critical minerals, which were once rather obscure inputs in things like battery technology and aerospace, have very much emerged as central to national resilience, as well as to economic and environmental transition. They are also increasingly a mirror that reflects how different nations, whether the US, the EU, Russia, China, or Ukraine, understand their strategic roles in a hotly contested environment. We will explore three questions today, three core questions. One, how have critical minerals come to occupy such a central place in national security and diplomacy? And what does this look like from a European vantage, where the war in Ukraine is not just an abstraction, but very much a lived reality that shapes the continent's future. Two, what distinguishes the EU, the US, and the Chinese approaches to mineral supply chains, and how do these approaches express their deeper geopolitical anxieties and ambitions? And three, finally, can mineral diplomacy serve really as a platform for principled cooperation, or are we headed instead toward intensified strategic rivalry over these minerals? So to help us navigate these questions, we are joined by a truly international panel of very distinguished voices. From Ukraine, we have Ivan Uz, who is Chief Consultant at the Center for Foreign Policy at the National Institute for Strategic Studies. Ivan, an honor to meet you, and thank you very much for joining.
Thank you very much for the invitation, and I will be glad to participate in the discussion.
Wonderful, wonderful. From China, we have Qinduo, who is a journalist at CGTN and senior fellow at the Pangoal Institution. Qinduo, very good to meet you and glad you could join us.
Thank you for having me.
And finally, we have Jim Mullinax, a senior foreign service officer whom I met when he's actually consul general at the erstwhile U.S. Consulate in Chengdu, and who took me out for a particularly memorable meal with his particularly memorable wife in that remarkable city. Jim, thank you for joining, and great to see you again.
Yeah, it's really a pleasure to be here, Kaiser. Thank you.
And from Brussels, we have Grzegorz Stec, who's a senior analyst and head of the Brussels office at MERICS. So glad that you could join us, Greg.
Thanks a lot for the invitation, Kaiser.
Let's jump right in. I want to put the first question to Ivan. The U.S.-Ukraine mineral security partnership, it's been heralded by some in Washington as a strategic alignment between these two countries. It's framed, of course, as a partnership. It's right there in the title. But given the economic and political pressure that Ukraine faces, how should we really understand this deal, especially from Kyiv's perspective? Is it an expression of solidarity and actual partnership? Or is it really more of a transactional arrangement tied to post-war resource leverage?
So first of all, prehistory of the question, because before October 2024, no one talks a lot about rare earth minerals in Ukraine, and this topic was not so popular. But closer to October 2024, in Ukraine, it was clear understanding that with high probability, in US president election that was on November 2024, Donald Trump can win. And of course, in Ukraine, we start thinking, taking into account Donald Trump rhetoric that he don't plan to support Ukraine, don't plan to give military aid to Ukraine. Ukraine starts thinking that we need to create something that can interest Donald Trump in that activity. And approximately at that period, appears so-called victory plan of President Zelensky with several items, and two of them was directly oriented on Donald Trump. The first, actually, of that was interesting for Donald Trump was created with co-authorship of Boris Johnson, a former Prime Minister of the United Kingdom. He proposed the idea that Ukrainian soldiers in future can substitute US soldiers in the European bases. So now we know that the United States of America planned to change the place of the place where their soldiers actually now sits in Europe for other geographical directions, so not to be in Europe. That's why the proposition to substitute US soldiers by Ukrainian soldiers, of course, was supported by Donald Trump. But the second moment that actually we discussed now, it was the idea with, as of October in Ukraine, we talk a lot, with co-authorship of the senator from Republican Party, Lindsey Graham. Mm-hmm. And Lindsey Graham proposed that if you propose the idea about joint exploration of your resources, it will be very interesting to Donald Trump. And Ukraine actually in this victory plan said that we should actually have this rare earth deal. We should think how to cooperate in this area. And after Donald Trump had first victory and then inauguration, he really expressed his interest to this topic. But after that, it was something like discussion between two sides, because from Ukrainian perspective, it should be guarantee of US support for Ukraine in this war. Because we understand that without the United States of America, for Europe, it will be extremely hard to be with us. Because yes, we have a good relationship with European countries. We have good relationship with second NATO army, is Turkey army. But unfortunately, the level of military production in Europe is not so high like in the United States. That's why we need them. And in that time, we decided to use philosophy that if you want to succeed in some case, you should make as many shareholders of your victory as you could, and you receive this victory. So Ukraine decided to make from the US the shareholder of our victory, meaning that we propose a deal about rare earths and saying that if the victory will be in Ukrainian hands, US can receive benefit from that victory. But the next first months is probably of this discussion based on the idea that the United States, the Donald Trump administration, they want to see their benefits, but they don't want to have obligation. Furthermore, it was idea at first that Ukraine should have some debt for previous aid that we received for free. So it means that we undermine the basic rule in this war, that you could not change the legislation when it works. So you could not say that something you received for free, and now it's not for free, you should pay for the things that you received for free. And second, that US can receive the veto on our integrational processes, and for Ukraine it was a big problem because our main idea to be in the European Union. So we are afraid that the United States of America can say that we don't think that the European Union is a good partner and we ban to you to integrate to European Union. Of course, for Ukraine, we could not accept that. And then, of course, it was talks about existing projects and so on and so forth. So that's why, on the one hand, this deal was prepared till the 28th of February, but on the 28th of February, whole world sees this clash in the Oval Office of White House. When it was not fighting. It's good, but it was a big scandal and it was not signing a deal. And after that, a lot of people think that it's a dot on the story. But of course, it was not dot because the United States of America started to prepare its own version that was even stricter than previous one. And of course, Ukraine was not agree with that.
Right.
And yes, and Ukraine made a step. We invited lawyers from other countries to prepare a very good deal for both Ukraine and US, because our position was simple, that this deal should not be stopped by the court decision. If the court say that it's a legal deal, it means that there will be no deal at all. And that's why we start working on it. Furthermore, in parallel story, that the United States of America decided to undermine global trade order when the increased tariffs practically make a dot on the story of the World Trade Organization. And if you're at that moment, if everyone can read newspapers, they think that the response of other countries to increased US tariffs will be banned for giving rare earth minerals to the United States. And in US, a lot of media start to say that United States of America need to sign a deal with as many countries as they could, according rare earth minerals, and Ukraine was like an example. So something like deal with Ukraine. And of course, it was a card in Ukrainian hands that its deal needed not so for Ukraine, as of course it's needed for Ukrainian military aid, but it's so needed for US interest to have such a deals. And that is for me helped to return to normal dialogue. Then was a meeting between second or first even after this clash and second after Donald Trump became a president, meeting between President Zelensky and Donald Trump. It was in Vatican, where initially should be 3 actually members of this meeting, but we see this video when the chair for Emmanuel Macron, the president of France, was eliminated. It was only 2 chairs, only 2 chairs. And after that discussion, several days after, Ukraine signed this deal. And immediately after signing the rare earth deal with the United States of America, we received at first the deblocking of the $50 million deal for selling, not giving, but selling weapon to Ukraine. Then it was a green light from the US administration for giving spare parts for F-16 fighter jets to Ukraine. That was important. Then it was information about $350 million selling weapon to Ukraine. And after that, it was a green light for Israel to give their anti-rocket system to Ukraine. Plus, it was deal for the Germany producers of anti-rocket systems to give its technology to Ukraine with using of US technology. That's why they need approval from the United States. But another moment that I mentioned before, actually, the initiator of this idea was Lindsey Graham. And just after this signing of this memorandum, the Lindsey Graham made a statement that he prepared a draft of the law about 500% tariffs on the products of those countries who buying products from Russia. We enter oil, gas, and some other sources. Not all products, but several sources. And of course, everyone understands that it's a very hard for Russia actually sanctions, because it's demotivate other countries to have a deal with Russia. It doesn't mean that this law will be accepted. Nevertheless, the fact that Lindsey Graham start to advertise this idea, we in Ukraine at least understand that it's a reaction on this signing deal. And now when more and more information appears about, now we know that we talks about 57 rare earth minerals in Ukrainian land, and we are not talking about current projects. We're talking about future projects. So, of course, from approximately 20,000 deposits of different rare earths in Ukraine, we explore 3,500 of them. So it means that we have a big field of work for the future, but it's very important for us was to talk about future, not about the past.
Let's leave it there for now. I mean, you've given us quite a bit of detail on the intricacies and the complexities of all, not only the geopolitical, but also the geostrategic pressures that forces that have come into play in creating this. It's interesting that Boris Johnson and Lindsey Graham, and I think anyone in the Kyiv leadership itself, were able to fully anticipate the transactional nature of a Donald Trump administration, were it to have come in, and it did, but perhaps didn't estimate how unilaterally coercive and advantage-seeking he would be in the end. Let me turn to Jim. This agreement embeds quite broad investment rights and privileged offtake provisions for U.S.-backed entities. Some would see it as a commitment to Ukraine's long-term recovery. Related to the question I just put to Ivan, we must note that others will likely see the deal as a form of, as you said, economic preconditioning, extractive or even quite coercive in tone. How do you see the balance between support and self-interest in how this partnership is actually structured?
Yeah, thanks for that really great question, Kaiser. Before I start, I just need to offer a little bit of a caveat. You mentioned I am a senior foreign service officer with the Department of State, currently on detail to the Wilson Center, where I write and research on economic security and economic statecraft related issues. And the remarks that I'm making today are in my personal capacity, do not reflect necessarily the views of the Department of State or the US government. So with that out of the way, let me just respond to your question. So the agreement between the government of Ukraine and the government of the United States, I think, is really multi-purpose. And understanding the importance of critical minerals to the United States and the potential that Ukraine holds for being a source of critical minerals, I think it's really important to have a realistic perspective on what this agreement actually does. First of all, while we know that while we believe, I should say, that there are critical minerals available in Ukraine, as in many, many parts of the world, the geographic surveys that sort of outline what's actually there in Ukraine date from the Soviet era. And so there haven't been really any updated surveys for 30, 40 years what's available in Ukraine. in what quantities, where they are, what it might cost to get them out, the capital expenditures required, et cetera, et cetera. And so, there's a lot of work to be done to actually see real economic activity coming out of this agreement in the critical minerals space. There are several reasons why I think it's important that the U.S. Wanted to sign this agreement. The first is obviously we are looking for alternative sources for critical minerals. China does have a very large percentage of the global production of critical minerals, both in terms of the geographic distribution of the minerals, the mining operations, and almost monopoly over a lot of the processing of these minerals. Yeah. And so, it's in the U.S. interest and other countries as well, whether it's Europe or Japan or others, to have a diversified supply of these types of things. Ukraine could be a really interesting possibility for a source. Ivan also mentioned the desire on the part of the administration, the Trump administration, to find ways to recoup some of the money that has been spent providing weapons and other types of support to Ukraine during this war. And so the prospect of helping U.S. companies to have a leg up in this market, I think, was very attractive to the Trump administration. As I said, the prospect of actually receiving some of this, or creating some of this economic activity is years away, but it does give U.S. companies the right of first refusal for certain types of natural resource and infrastructure projects, and provides incentives through tax-free status, pledges that the U.S. will not impose any tariffs on imports of critical minerals or other mineral resources from Ukraine into the United States, which obviously is a big deal in the Trump administration. Interestingly, it's not just critical minerals that are included in this deal. I mean, it's natural resources more broadly, including hydrocarbons. And so there's a real possibility that the initial types of things that we see coming out of Ukraine under this agreement might not be, I don't know, antimony or some other critical minerals, but maybe something like gas, right? Might be oil. Those types of things are also included in the deal, and so we'll have to wait and see exactly how that works. So there's two things there. The other two things, really quickly, I'll just mention is, I think from the U.S. perspective, this is a really important way to send a message to Russia, in particular, that the U.S. is very much committed to being engaged with Ukraine. And that's an important message for Ukraine, obviously, and for our European partners to understand and hear. It's also an important message for the U.S. to sort of stand up and deliver. So that's really important. The second thing I'll mention is that in the sort of the preamble to this agreement, the Ukrainian side and the American side have both made a statement to the effect that it is our joint desire to see that those states and other persons who have acted to support the aggression against Ukraine would not benefit from the reconstruction and economic activities in Ukraine once a peace agreement is in place. And so, this is a way for the U.S. and Ukraine to sort of say very loudly, look, this is, if you are against us, if you're against Ukrainian sovereignty, we want to kind of put a stop sign up in terms of your future activities, the economic activities, and benefit from the reconstruction of Ukraine when this war is over. And we want those benefits to flow to others.
Is the subtextual target of that China?
I think you'd have to put China at the top of that list, and also Russia.
Well, yeah, Russia obviously, but interesting. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you, but please.
No, but I was just finishing up, and I think that's exactly the right analysis to draw from that, the right conclusion to draw from that. Yeah.
Very good. Let's turn to Greg from MERICS. Europe has arguably borne the greatest cost of the war, apart from Ukraine itself, by everyone's accounting except for President Trump's accounting, where of course it's America that's borne the greatest cost. Yet this agreement appears heavily bilateral with limited transparency around EU involvement. How does this U.S.-Ukraine mineral partnership look from Brussels? Is there concern that American economic priorities may crowd out or even override European reconstruction interests, European participation in that process?
Thanks a lot, Kaiser. No, of course. I mean, this deal is seen from Brussels' perspective as a bit of a mixed bag because you have two competing priorities now, if you take a look at it from the European perspective. On one hand, it's really about keeping the US involvement in Ukraine and more broadly within NATO and within Europe for as long as we can in order for us to proceed with our own defense spending to actually bear fruit. So in that sense, getting some level of greater commitment and the positive signal from the side of Trump administration is obviously positive. At the same time, as you do point out, it is also a bit of an economic hurdle. Brussels and generally speaking, Europe is now, of course, in the process of really finding new diversified sources in terms of critical raw materials. And this is something that has been really on top of the agenda of the European Commission. Last year, we had the Critical Raw Materials Act that really puts forward specific goals that Europe has in that regard. So in that sense, yes, there is a big worry in the sense that US will be a dominant force within Ukraine in that context. We had also a specific counteroffer that was framed around more of a win-win approach coming from the European side back in February, when things looked a little bit differently when it comes to the prospects of the deal between US and Ukraine. So yeah, we see it, I would say, in those two aspects at the same time. But more broadly, looking from the European perspective, we are now exactly in this moment where we are strongly dependent in the context of CRMs. This is something that the European level has really come to realize. There have been specific analysis conducted by the European Commission in 2021, 2022, in terms of analyzing our dependencies. You had this entire push across the European system following COVID, especially. Where do we have dependencies? Where do we have vulnerabilities? Where are our choke points? Oh my God, what are the things that we really need to work on? And of course, CRMs are really on top of this. And in that context, as also in the context of Jim's response, yes, Brussels lives by the mantra of being country agnostic, but there is a specific country that comes on the top of that list. Because if you think about it, 70%, if you take a look at a broader picture, 73% of all cobalt in the world is mined in Congo, 69% of rare earths elements mined in China, half of the global nickel supply in Indonesia. So that already puts it into a problematic category. But if you think about it, that 98% of the rare earth elements imported to Europe come from China, there is a very clear dependence. And this is something where there was an acknowledgement that it is an issue. And it's also not an issue where I think we would be acting on, totally simply this estimation and the question of increased vulnerability. We had this case when this dependency was leveraged vis-a-vis Sweden, for example, in 2020, 2021, where the two types of graphite exports to Sweden from China have effectively stopped in the context of some of the dynamics related to Huawei, and Sweden banning Huawei being the context here, but also the competition in the battery sector coming from a Swedish company, Northvolt, that was the leading European potential competitor. So, there are a lot of pieces here, and exactly. And we are seeing all the investments coming from China into Europe, in Hungary, especially in the battery sector. So there are a lot of moving pieces in terms of how the EU side would be evaluating that deal, looking also at the fact that having US more involved, yes, it's good. At the same time, we're increasingly evaluating the challenging relationship that I think we're going to have with Washington, at least for the next few years.
Very good, very good. I'm going to turn to Qinduo right now. China, Mr. Xu, is often portrayed as the implicit competitor in these critical mineral strategies. As we just heard from Jim, there's quite pointed language in this agreement aimed tacitly, at least, at China. And from Greg in his discussion about how this is being framed from the European vantage point. From your perspective, Qinduo, how does Beijing view these types of bilateral US arrangements in resource-rich, quite geopolitically vulnerable countries such as Ukraine? Does China see this as more economic competition or as part of a broader pattern of resource securitization under US strategic dominance?
Thank you, Kaiser. This is a good question. This is a complex one. I think it's also, from Chinese point of view, we see that as on one hand, it's a transactional. Obviously, Kyiv is seeking the U.S. involvement, the U.S. continuous engagement, so as to ward off the Russian forces. They don't have cash to hand in to Donald Trump, so they say, okay, here's a potential. Because you care so much about mineral resources, the rare earth, we have rare earth here, although that is not a proven one. Remember, maybe two surveys of mineral resources in Ukraine, and the data is in the hands of Moscow. It's not even in Kiev. And so anyway, I don't think Donald Trump understands at all, whether there is rare earth, how much is there. But anyway, it doesn't matter. But this is from President Zelensky, the offer, and to make it as attractive as possible to Donald Trump. You have a lot to make by signing this contract. Anyway, he did it. So this is transactional for the immediate purpose, of course, the security for Ukraine, understandable. But for the U.S. side, of course, we understand the U.S. wants to basically make sure, if there are any resources, we want to have a hand, U.S. hand on that, to make sure in the future development, either it's the U.S. companies or at least no Chinese companies. We have a say in which companies will mine this resources and do business in Ukraine. So in that sense, Beijing is not happy to see that because, we have a globalization, we have trade rules, you don't do that. Basically, of course, it's up to the two countries, Ukraine and the US. So they need each other in that sense. Okay, fine. But then there's a pattern like that. I think that is concerning for Beijing. We see this, we call it a poison clause, right? Basically said that Ukraine should not do business with China unless we agree, unless there's a green light from Washington. And then you have this. If you take a look at the trade deal between Washington and London, there's also such a clause saying that if you want to escape steel export tariff. And, we have a say in who will own your steel plant targeting China again. I don't know what kind of practice this. I think this is troubling, to Beijing and to probably, to the global rules. What kind of rules we are following here? That is a big question. And then there's a concern, of course, other countries, when they sign deals over tariffs with the United States, basically, as it reported in some media, the question from Washington is like, what are you doing with Beijing? And what will you do with Beijing? Basically said that you have to follow my rules in terms of conducting business with Beijing. So this is like the U.S. way of attempting to maintain their primacy around the world, of course, against China in their eyes as a competition. But obviously, you can ask whether this is a fair competition. This is the competition as we understand, or this is a new practice from Washington. In that sense, I think Beijing will do what it needs to do to protect its own interests.
It's very interesting to hear you put this in the context of the U.S. negotiation of trade deals with other third countries, because I think that's something that's often left out of the reporting that we see about this specific deal with Ukraine. Yvonne, I want to turn back to you. The agreement, in my reading of the text at least, it emphasizes Ukraine's responsibility to shield investors from domestic legal or political changes, even privileging the treaty over future laws that may be written. That seems, that borders, in my mind, on extraterritoriality. Do these investor protections risk constraining Ukraine's democratic sovereignty or its fiscal flexibility during a time of what we hope will be rebuilding, deep transformation, and war recovery?
Of course, as actually our president said, that first of all, we need to invite US investors just for receiving the security guarantee. And now we are talking about future, actually. It's not about current projects. It means that after, first of all, end of war, probably this project can't be realized. But after the end of war means the war should be win. And actually, for winning this war, we need this support. And after that, of course, we were thinking how to actually understand what we will doing, because we talk a lot about this deal, but the former deputy minister of foreign affairs of Ukraine, Lana Dzerkali, she approximately half a year ago, or when this idea appeared in October 2024, said a phrase that for understanding how many and what actually these rare earth minerals we have in Ukraine, we need to make something like a research. And this research, according to her estimation, will cost $25 million. So we at first just need to understand about what we are talking about, because now we sell to US a promise that they receive the big rights in the future projects. US understands these rights for first 100 days of Donald Trump in office. It was a good reason to him to say that he have big achievement, he have this deal. This deal can be copied by deals with some other countries. It's the first of them. So that's why now it's politically we receive some benefits. The question how it will be realized in future, because of course one of the ideas of this deal that exists in Ukraine long before, it's sources for production of titanium. Because before that, Ukraine has a special ore for making titanium. This ore goes to Russia. Russia has manufacturing facilities to produce actually titanium and then sold it to the United States of America, because they need titanium for their aircraft, for building civilian airspace, and so on and so forth. So in Ukraine, we always said that we have sources. United States of America has actually interest to this metals. Question why we need the third country who will produce it. We could organize it either in the United States or in Ukraine, and we'll do it without Russia, because a large dependence on Russia economy, they influence on the course of war of Russia against Ukraine, when a lot of countries could not impose sanctions versus Russia due to that dependence. And that's why now we see problem in Europe when they have enormous big dependence on Russian gas. And we see how other countries try not to have the same dependence. First of all, it's a destiny of so-called Siberian Stream 2, because Russia want to build it. China say, no, we don't need this Siberian 2 because we have your share in our gas consumption. And if you want to sell to us more, do that according to your internal prices. And internal prices in Russia, it's a very low level. So if Russia will sell gas to China on local prices, it means that they will not receive money for that, because it's subsidized, local prices. So that's why we see that this dependence on Russian sources really create a problem for Ukraine. And that's why, for example, in case of titanium, we said that, okay, so let's think how to use our sources and how to US receive this titanium, but without participation of Russia. So
Ivan, let me ask you a quick question while we're on the subject of titanium and other critical minerals. Titanium probably doesn't count as a critical mineral, strictly speaking, but many of these potential reserves are in the eastern part of the country that are currently under Russian occupation. How does that figure into U.S. calculations of the deal? I mean, does that strengthen the probability that the United States will push for a settlement of the war that will return the Donbass to Ukrainian control in the interest of preserving these mineral rights that they've secured?
Of course, yes, because the majority of the rare earth minerals in the not controlled by Ukraine territory, it's Donbass, first of all, the Donetsk and Lugansk region, and Crimea too, actually. That's why it's something like a motivation to the United States. Please help us to regain control over those territories. Yes, we hear a statement from Donald Trump that Ukraine should forget about Crimea, but Ukraine is not ready to forget about Crimea. Furthermore, it's a local Black Sea region relationship, but as I said, second army in NATO, Turkey, so extremely against of giving to Russia chance to recognize and legitimize Crimea as their part, because Crimea, it's big peninsula in the Black Sea region, and Turkey that historically compete with Russia for Black Sea. They are not glad that Russia increased their opportunities in Black Sea after annexing Crimea. So that's why we think that it should be something to motivate US really to help us to return control over those territories. And this deal is something like that, because in Ukraine there is and in financial world there is a big joke that if you receive grants that you should not return, it means that people give you money for and want to forget about you. If they give to you credits that you should return, it means that they believe in your victory. So that's why Ukraine finds something to interest US to believe in our victory and really to help us to get this victory. And after getting this victory, after gaining control over the Donbass, of course, this project about rare earth minerals will be realized. I mean, you knew of them that was not explored by Ukraine for whole period after regaining independence after 1991. So now at least there is motivation to US to help to explore it. To Ukraine, of course, it will be important in the process of rebuilding of Ukraine, because we understand that after this full-scale war, we need a lot of sources to rebuild everything. And even though we talk a lot about frozen Russian money, but the material damage that Russia committed to Ukraine as for August 2024 was estimated $1,164 billion. And Russia has $300 billion frozen assets. So it's not enough, plus parallel moment Syria that so want to have some part of Russian money for their rebuilding. So we understand that we should find something that really motivate people to invest in Ukraine. And this deal, the rare earth deal, especially exploring the deposits existing in the not controlled as of now territory of Ukraine, it's something that help us in future. So it's a really deal about future opportunity to Ukraine to receive the US investment and money for reconstruction period. Thank you, Kaiser.
Thank you, Ivan. I want to turn to Jim now and ask you, so this agreement quite explicitly links increased US contributions to military assistance. It treats weapons transfers basically as de facto capital investments, which is a novel and some, including me, would say somewhat troubling mechanism. I wonder whether this can be squared with the ideas of a rule-based market-oriented recovery framework, or for that matter, with longstanding American values. I'm not going to ask you to talk to that specifically, but I do want to ask you about what you mentioned earlier about the sort of implicit targeting of China in the recovery process, in the reconstruction of Ukraine. And I wonder whether it is deluded on the part of the American negotiators to imagine a Ukrainian rebuilding that excludes China. China is the world's master builder right now. It's overcapacity, it's vaunted overcapacity in things like steel production, could offer a way out for Ukraine, a way forward for rebuilding of Ukraine. There's a lot of engineering and construction talent that isn't finding expression necessarily in China domestically right now. This is, people who built the Belt and Road. What is America thinking in this?
Yeah, that's a great question, Kaiser. Thank you. Let me just firstly touch on the capital contribution piece of this. And while I'm not a lawyer and I wasn't involved in the negotiations, obviously, I will say that I think that there are really good reasons to sort of look at how the U.S. is providing assistance to Ukraine, with the kinds of assistance that is provided to Ukraine, and for the Trump administration, whether there are ways to see if there's a possibility of recouping some of that money, right, over the long term. As I said, this is a prospective agreement. Any real value that will come out of this agreement to the United States and also to Ukraine, first of all, we'll need to wait till the end of the war, and secondly, will take a considerable amount of time to come to fruition. And so, this is just a way, I think, for the U.S. to ensure that it continues to have skin in the game as it moves forward in whatever happens in the peacetime framework that we all hope is coming soon to Ukraine. With respect to the sort of the preamble of this agreement and the statement about trying, being eager to ensure that the benefits that flow to Ukraine are flowing to them in ways that are not benefiting those who have acted against Ukraine's interests. Let me just say, I don't think this is just a U.S. objective or a U.S. preference. For many Ukrainians, and I don't want to speak for Ivan here, but for many Ukrainians I've spoken to over the past 3 or 4 years that I've been involved in conversations with Ukrainian counterparts, they are deeply concerned and upset by the support that China has provided to Russia over the past several years, providing dual-use goods, propping up Russia's economy in many ways, helping Russia to mitigate the impact of sanctions and export controls that have been imposed by the United States, Europe, and partners around the world. And so, for Ukrainians, as well as for Americans, and I would think as well, I mean, I won't want to speak for Greg, but for Europeans, I would think as well, concerns about the Chinese or others who have supported Russia's aggression in Ukraine benefiting from the reconstruction, it's a bit galling. So while this doesn't have, this statement doesn't have the effect of law, it's not going to, it's not a legal prohibition against contracting with anybody in particular. I think there's a real preference to see that the benefits of any reconstruction are flowing to those supporters of Ukraine and not those who've acted against Ukraine's interests.
Very good. And then speaking of China here, let's turn this to Qinduo. Despite this temporary truce in the U.S. trade war that was negotiated in Geneva, Beijing, as has been widely reported, has kept its rare earth export licensing regime in place. What message is Beijing sending with this? I mean, is it just a matter of keeping the powder dry? Is it fair to say that China sees critical minerals maybe less as market commodities and maybe more as tools of strategic statecraft in this emerging multipolar order? How do you see this?
I see it as it's done with dual purpose. On one hand, as a way, as a leverage, against the U.S. U.S. crackdown on the Chinese technology, on the Chinese export. For example, the latest one, U.S. basically threatening every country in the world, don't use advanced chips produced in China, including the
Huawei Ascend.
That kind of practice is standing for a lot of people here.
Yeah,
and so there's a leverage. If the U.S. continue to do something to hurt China, China has a leverage against the U.S. practice. And secondly, I think it's more like a negotiating tool in the future talks between the two countries. Let's say, okay, let's walk back. China, if U.S. walk back from some of the restrictions, unfair practice, and China will say, I guess, we will walk back in terms of relaxing all those control of mineral resources, rare earth. So otherwise, what do you have to negotiate with Washington? The practice from the Chinese side is like kowtowing to Washington is not a choice. You have to stand up against Trump is acting like a school big bully in school. So in the schoolyard, so you have to do like a tit for tat kind of strategy against him. So that's I think a dual purpose.
Keep a brick in your book bag, as it were, to use a cultural revolution era. Staying with you, what's your take about what we've just been discussing about China's potential participation in the recovery of Ukraine and how vital that will be, and what role China might have to play?
Good question here. I just want to respond to what Jim has said. Jim again, repeat what Washington has said, and the West in general, saying China is helping Russia somehow against Ukraine. This is simply wrong, and they are trying to deepen such a concept. Somehow, of course, this is against China. This is competition between Washington and Beijing. I understand that, but look. I have a Russian colleague complaining to the Chinese side, the Ukrainians are using Chinese drones in the battlefield, killing Russian soldiers. Is China providing weapons to the Ukrainian side, or is China providing weapons to the Russian side? It's a market. DJI, the drones, bought. The belief is that it was bought by the whole land, and then they transferred that to Ukraine. So you have a market economy there, a lot of players. I don't think Beijing can control all the players over there. So that's fine, I guess. And Beijing is not exactly siding with Russia against Ukraine. Let me make it really blunt. Beijing is siding with Russia against the U.S. because the U.S. is pressuring, is cornering both Russia and China. So they choose to stay together simply against the United States, not against the Ukraine at all, at least for Beijing. So, Beijing suffered from a huge loss in terms of this war because Beijing was not prepared for the Russian, obviously, the invasion there. And then, a lot of investment in terms under the Belt and Road Initiative, a lot of construction projects in Ukraine. And I would say Beijing, the Chinese companies would be more than happy to help if the war stops, to help with, whatever projects in Ukraine. And China probably is probably the only country with the capacity and with the ability, with the tools, with the technology, with the machines, to rebuild the nation as quickly as possible. I don't think the U.S. Companies are in the position to do that at all. Despite all the U.S. Insisting having a say in the future business operation in Ukraine. But this is for the immediate, for the near, very purpose of having U.S. engaged to support Ukraine. But look, after the mineral deals were signed, the war is going on, and the Russians continuing to bombing the Ukrainians, right? And any purpose, if there's a purpose, is that purpose being achieved? I think people should raise that question. Obviously, it failed.
Very interesting. And again, we hear this perspective a lot that really the Beijing's decision to lean toward Russia in this is more about huddling together to stay warm, 抱团取暖, more than a preference. But I've heard this from many people, and I think that's there's a lot to that. Let me turn to Grzegorz. So Greg, the EU has advanced its own, like you said, Critical Raw Materials Act and strategic autonomy agenda to some extent. Do you see Ukraine as more likely to be economically anchored in a US-led framework or in a European one when this war ends, as we all very sincerely hope it does soon? Or is it possible for Europe to pursue a kind of dual alignment? And if so, or I'm sorry, for Ukraine to pursue a dual alignment, and if so, how would that work?
Thanks a lot, Kaiser. I mean, definitely responding from the European side, I would say that obviously we hope that the future of Ukraine is European one within our common family or within the EU. But maybe allow me to first just quickly comment on the points that have been raised so far.
Absolutely, sure.
If I can. So first of all, when it comes to China's support for Russia, I mean, I strongly invite everyone, if I'm allowed to drop name of one project that we have been working on the China-Russia dashboard, together with colleagues from OSW in Poland and also from the Swedish China Knowledge Center, which provides in graphs hard data on what we know about the China-Russia relationship since the beginning of the war and how it has been coming together. So strongly invite everyone to give it a look on this point, because I do think that we are seeing definitely this relationship coming closer, also in the context of increasing cooperation in the military sphere. And this is something where the concern on the European side is really considerable, even aside from Ukraine as such, which is obviously already concerned China's activity in that context, is that the assessment on the European side is that once whatever the conclusion of Russian invasion is, Russia is going to probably rearm and take another action in which we are worried about the position that China would take under such circumstances. So this is a wider question for Europe beyond just the question of China's role in the context of Ukraine. Quickly on the topic of rebuilding, to my mind, we do land, to my mind, somewhere in the middle, because yes, indeed, simply the financial needs of this kind of reconstruction would be so high that in many cases, China is the viable option in the context of simply the cost of processing such reconstruction. At the same time, I do think that there are big concerns in the context of in which sectors China would be participating in that space, because we are all progressing with our assessment of China's involvement in critical infrastructure in Europe. And I believe, as we're talking exactly about the prospects of increased Ukrainian integration into the EU, there would be concerns about whether usage, for example, of some of the Chinese telecom providers would be aligned with the guidelines and the norms that we're setting up for ourselves within the EU. So I think this is really a mixed picture where there is no clear all in or all out response in the context of Chinese participation. But turning to your original question, sorry for this detour at the beginning.
No problem.
Yes, looking from the European perspective, I mean, this is largely where we see that the approach that we have been seeing from the side of the US has been to a large extent one driven by national security concerns. You also see the fact that US relies on the Defense Production Act in the context of collaboration with Australia on CRMs. So we do see that angle. We have a slightly different angle, one that comes more from the position of exactly trying to build open strategic autonomy, trying to ensure that we address our vulnerabilities and overdependencies. And in many regards, the kind of deals that the EU is trying to make over CRMs, as it has with Australia, Uzbekistan, Serbia, under the umbrella of the Global Gateway, the kind of reaction that Europe has to Belt and Road Initiative, they still have a very strong sustainability requirement aspect to it, which in a way is a problem, because this is exactly what we're good at, right? As the EU, we are the institutionalists, the globalists, the regulators in the room, and we are now learning to really operate in this much more geopolitical, unilateral, fast-moving environment. And this is part of the problem, because US also comes with much more funding, which is something that we still struggle with. So we come with very good frameworks that we're now trying to fill with financing, where the support from the side of the European Commission, in cooperation with member states, in cooperation with banks, should be able to channel also more private funding to it. But we'll see how this ends up going. Very quickly on the US-EU interactions in that space, I think Ukraine is part of it. We also have to remember Greenland, towards which President Trump also has voiced some ideas, let's put it at this. But in 2023, according to European Commission surveys, 25 out of 34 CRMs that we defined are present in Greenland. So the CRM question also applies to a large extent to the relationship between US and EU in the context of Greenland. But it is not just to say, oh my God, we're on the collision course here. There is no way to navigate that. Because if we take a look at, for example, what the EU is doing in Romania, where there is a very big investment in magnesium mining, it's done together with a private investor from the US. It's also an investment that is seeking to create the processing that would feature aluminum outputs that would be up to 9% of global demand. So we can do things together. We're already together in the mineral security partnership. There are things that we can still do together. The key question is, right now, we're not necessarily in the best political dynamic. We don't have a clear indication of where US wants to actually take our relationship and what are the actual demands. And it has been hard for the European counterparts to actually reach out to Washington to get the meetings, to discuss the details, to discuss the proposals. So in that sense, it's a mixed bag, but also in the context of Ukraine, I think it's a question of modalities, because we have definitely from the European side, the interest in supporting Ukraine. It's not going away, because Ukraine is Europe. And in that sense, this is not going to be changing.
Very good. Thank you very much, Greg. I'm turning back to Ivan now. Ivan, Article 7 of the agreement, Article 8 of the agreement gives US-backed investors significant first rights. We've talked about the right of refusal to offtake minerals on market terms with additional protections against more favorable terms offered to others. This reminds me of some of the treaties that China signed in the mid-19th century with most favored nation clauses, as well as the sort of hints frankly, at extraterritoriality that we've seen before. Do you worry that this is going to limit Ukraine's ability to diversify its investor base or to negotiate better terms with other strategic partners in Europe or elsewhere?
Of course, before signing this deal, we discussed a lot with lawyers, and it's not a secret that our government and Ministry of Justice of Ukraine invited several law companies, and they actually said that this article will not contradict to Euro integration way, or it could not create a big problem. Of course, we understand that something should be interesting for the United States for investing in this new project. But first of all, as I said, it's very important that we're talking about future one, not about existing one and
right.
the realized one.
A future being maybe after Donald Trump is out of office.
Actually, a lot of people say that, that at this moment, Ukraine needs this deal for receive US support. As if, something creates a problem, we can rediscuss. Probably it will be not Donald Trump, it will be the next president, because for years, his term, it will be who knows, of course, he joked about his third term, but I don't think that it's a serious one, and I'm not sure that Congress give them to Donald Trump green light to re-elect for the third term, because after actually Roosevelt time there was no president for more than 2 terms. Nevertheless, I think that this question could be rediscussed after his presidency, or I think that we can find a good solution, because we need investments from the United States of America, and of course I think that it should be decided in trialogue between EU, Ukraine, and the United States of America, because in Ukraine we couldn't say when we actually will be in EU, but at least the most optimistic actually assessment 2030, so only in 5 years. Probably it will be more than 5 years. Nevertheless, if Ukraine will be EU country, so of course it means that EU should be present in all talks as for actually its future territory. And I think that then we decided all controversial moments that could be created in this deal. But even some lawyers now talking about the moment that Ukraine signs this deal in time when we are under big pressure of war. When there will be no war, we will see what will be. But of course, Ukraine, I try to emphasize, interested in receiving investment from US and investment in rare earth minerals too. Thank you, Kaiser.
Thank you, Ivan. I want to turn to Qinduo from CGTN. China's dominance in rare earths and other critical minerals, it gives it undeniable leverage. But there is a growing sense in some countries, certainly in the United States, that it's a form of economic hostage taking. There is perhaps a risk of strategic overreach. Now, of course, China can point to the United States and some of the other Western countries and what it's now trying to do in response to this in the global South, and say that this is very much maybe the same thing. But is there a worry in Beijing that excessive use of export controls or opaque licensing regimes around critical minerals or critical raw materials could end up actually accelerating this process of decoupling, that it could encourage other countries to invest more aggressively in alternative sources, or even maybe prompt more resource nationalism in the global South that could actually prove detrimental to Chinese interests? Is this something that Beijing is considering?
I think so. It's a double-edged sword. If you look at the U.S. tariff, it's the same, right? U.S. impose tariff on the rest of the world, and then you lose credibility. You lose, the goodwill from people from the rest of the world. People say, "Hey, U.S. is no longer the country we used to know, and it's not reliable." And then, of course, people will find a way, try to distance from U.S. or reduce reliance on the U.S. So China could be. If they are not careful, could land in a similar position. In terms of mineral resources, one example is the 2010, China, I would say, mismanaged its it's a rare earth. You still remember like a limit the export to Japan, right? That spurred the Japanese actually, effort to rely more on themselves in terms of rare earths. So this is a good lesson, and I think China should be as specific as possible, as narrow as possible. For example, you can targeting on the U.S. Let's say arms or ammunition companies, say, okay, if you sell weapons to Taiwan, that's the core interest of China, and we will limit this rare earth export to such companies.
Interestingly, I think
that's
it's
probably more,
if I
more
interrupt you.
more.
Well,
Yeah.
I think just pertaining to what you just said, I think it's very interesting that I've heard a very good discussion about the rare earths licensing regime. Apparently, in response to the so-called reciprocal tariffs announced on so-called Liberation Day, China actually did ban exports, but very specific, that were actually targeting the arms industry. These were not banning any of the light rare earths, but actually banning exports specifically of heavy rare earths that were used almost exclusively by American defense contractors. So I think you're absolutely, there's evidence that what you say is absolutely correct. So please go on.
Yes, I think China should. That's the practice. China should publicize it more to make it clear that it's not a threat to European countries, not a threat to other countries in the global south, for example. Of course, it's related to a larger topic we call like over dependence or de-risking policy from European countries, etc. China has no problem with European countries, or with global south countries in terms of using the processing technology, processed mineral resources from China. No, China is the largest trading partner of more than 120, in some cases more 140 economies around the world. China is promoting globalization because globalization is in the interest of the Chinese side. But in response to the U.S. tariff war, and the Chinese side will do what they can. That is the use of rare earth. But he's not targeting European countries. Of course, if they say, we want to reduce reliance on the Chinese side, that's their own sovereign decision. There's little Beijing can do in addition to probably try to persuade them, okay, we are good partners. We would like to continue to be a partner. But ultimately, it's like the Ukraine crisis. I think we should respect the sovereignty of Ukrainians, of the Ukraine as a country, as a nation. They will do whatever they like for the benefits of the interests of their own nation. And I don't think Washington should somehow rob Ukraine of, in the future, who you will do business with. That's simply unfair.
Jim, I've flicked at this a couple of times, but the agreement explicitly exempts U.S. firms from Ukrainian taxes and tariffs and shields them from domestic policy shifts. As I've suggested, for example, against future law. In your views, is this a necessary feature to attract capital? That's what it's being held out. Yvonne described it as that. It was just sort of intended to attract. Or is this a warning sign that reconstruction risks actually carving out a kind of zone for privileged foreign investors? I mean, again, that smacks to me of extraterritoriality. I'm wondering what you think of that.
Yeah, I mean, I appreciate the historical context here, but I'll also say that, these types of this type of production is going to require a lot of investment.
Yeah.
And it's going to require a lot of stability and certainty that is very much absent right now. Trying to create a framework that will encourage companies to do the heavy work and expensive work in the near term of exploring for these minerals, doing the land surveys, geological surveys that need to be undertaken, and then thinking through how to actually exploit these resources to the extent they are able to do so in ways that are economically viable. Having that framework established early is going to attract a lot more interest and a lot more investment. We all hope. I mean, that's certainly, I think, the U.S. side's hope. I think that's the Ukrainian side's hope as well. And to the point about sort of carving it off or creating some sort of extraterritoriality, this agreement doesn't say that the U.S. gets a better deal than anybody else. The U.S. This agreement says that any deal that the Ukrainians come up with, the U.S. should have the opportunity to make the first, make the first pitch at it. And if the U.S. firms are not interested in doing so, other firms can do those deals on the same terms, right? If the terms are better, if the Ukrainian side wants to provide better terms, the U.S. side would like to have a chance to participate on those terms if it's in our interest. And so I don't see necessarily that this is a form of extraterritoriality or somehow carving out exemptions from the law. It's just trying to create some sort of stability of expectations and saying, hey, if there's going to be a deal, the U.S. wants to be able to have the best terms that anybody else is going to be able to get.
Got it. Going back to you, Greg, is there a risk that the kinds of bilateral resource-focused deals that we're seeing now are going to fracture what was, until not so recently, a pretty coordinated multilateral approach to Ukraine's recovery, or what we hoped would be? I'm wondering how Europe could respond either by integrating these frameworks into these frameworks itself, or by asserting its own model of post-war economic engagement more assertively than it has so far. What is the plan here? How does Brussels see this all playing out, and how will it manage to insert itself more assertively into this process?
Sure, thanks. I think from the European perspective, one of the important things here is not to put the cart before the horse. First, sure, we need to ensure that Ukraine actually manages to win the war in the terms that are favorable to Ukraine. So in that sense, yes, the deal reached between US and Ukraine is a particular case, because this is a way of trying to incentivize greater commitment from new administration in Washington, and in that sense, it's highly relevant. But much of the discussions that we're currently having in Brussels are primarily about how to ensure that Ukraine can prevail and win in response to Russian invasion. At the same time, there are a number of instruments that could be used on the European side. We have already, of course, the Eastern Neighborhood instrument that has been relevant for the countries in the region. So putting simply more and putting more of the investment funds on the side of Europe into that space could be one of the options. Leveraging the global gateway also and targeting it more towards development projects in Ukraine could be another way, of course, with keeping in mind that any kind of development support right now is in short supply globally, partially also thanks to changes introduced by the Trump administration, but it becomes a wider trend globally, right? So it's going to be a very, very big question from the European side as well, of course, how we're going to navigate that. But I think right now, again, the priority for Europe is ensuring also its own security. So those are, let's say, the key aspects that we have on top of the agenda right now.
Very good. Well, we're approaching the end of our allotted time, and I wanted to get one question in from an audience member. He asked a very intriguing question of Qinduo, but I think it can be answered by really anyone else as well, as was suggested here. But why has China not yet used the Ukraine-U.S. mineral agreement as an argument to counter the American narrative and to accuse it of a form of neocolonialism? Does this reflect, he asks, a cautious stance toward Ukraine, a lack of informational or symbolic potential in the topic, or something else? Why has Beijing not yet, apparently, and I think he's right, and it's an interesting omission, has not yet weaponized, as it were, this mineral agreement?
Well, first of all, I think China is not looking for a war, even a war of words with the United States. The U.S. What China is doing is really to protect its own interests, against multi-front offensive from Washington. And secondly, I think what is slightly different from what happened, 100 years ago, basically in China, we call it humiliation period. Remember, Western powers basically, pressured the Chinese side when it was really weak, like today's Ukraine, to sign these unfair treaties, basically conceding rights to foreign powers, like today's Ukraine. But what's slightly different is like Ukraine needs the U.S. right now, need the U.S. Weapons, need the U.S. support politically, diplomatically. So it's a bit different. I think for China, China would say, China practice the principle of like respecting the sovereignty of Ukraine. It's a sovereign decision. The plan presented by President Zelensky. Many people would say President Zelensky is really smart, wise, and skilled in terms of let's say, cajoling Donald Trump into believing there's a huge potential, and then ultimately signing the deal with the Ukraine. So in that sense, China would say, okay, that's between Washington and Kiev. Yeah, we understand that, but okay, we'll leave that alone. I think probably that's what's behind that.
Okay, interesting. By the way, I should point out that question came from a former panelist on just such a session, Dmitry Yefremov, who was an excellent guest on a previous one, which you can actually listen to at the Sinica podcast. We do have a little bit of time. Why don't I go around and ask each of you to make some sort of a summation remark, and then we can just thank Vita and call an end to our excellent discussion today. And let me start again with you, Ivan, and then after you to Jim, then to Mr. Xu, and then to Greg.
First of all, thank you for the invitation. Really very interesting discussion. I think that topic of rare earth minerals half a year ago, no one talked about that at all. And now I think it's one of the main topic. And I think that our discussion was interesting. That's why I want to thank all spectaculars of our video. I think that they found something interesting in our this time talk. Thank you very much to all. Thank you.
Well, thank you. I mean, I think it was an excellent. Your first intervention was so rich in detail. It was just such a great timeline, and it did weave in so many factors that I think a lot of people simply do not give consideration to. And I think it's going to be worth going back and revisiting and dissecting carefully to enrich our understanding of what actually happened, especially as it was viewed from Kyiv itself. So thank you very much. Let's go to Jim.
Yeah, thanks, Kaiser. I'll just maybe make two really quick points if I could, or maybe re-emphasize some of the things that I said earlier. Number one, the Ukraine-U.S. critical minerals deal is really about multiple things, right? It's about potentially critical minerals in Ukraine, but more importantly, it's about demonstrating that the U.S. is committed to Ukraine and has skin in the game. And so that's the message I think that, I hope that people will take away from this deal, that the U.S. wants to support Ukraine. And this is a way for us to, over the long term, really demonstrate that we're going to be there. Secondly, with the idea about critical minerals more broadly, I mean, this is something that, with respect to Ivan, we've actually been talking about this for quite some time now, really since 2010 and beyond. The issue about dependence on certain countries, particularly China, for critical minerals, but not only China, is something that has occupied a lot of policymakers in the United States through the Obama administration, through the first Trump administration, Biden, and now the second Trump administration. And, through the course of all of those discussions over the last 10, 15 years, a few key principles have been, a through line through the whole conversation. And among those is that, diversification is really important because we don't want to be too reliant on any one source for critical minerals, particularly for our national security, but also for our economic security, because as you noted at the top, they are useful in so many different items that are part of our shared economic future. And so finding ways to work together with like-minded partners and allies to diversify our supplies and our ability to process critical minerals is really crucial. We have been doing that through the Mineral Security Partnership that Greg mentioned earlier, and through other mechanisms, bringing Ukraine into that process, looking for opportunities to work together with Ukraine, with other partners to diversify our critical minerals resources, global market, I think is really, really crucial to all of our success. And, this is the kind of thing where we need to be working together closely with the Europeans, with the Australians, with the Canadians, and others who sort of share our concerns about dependence for these types of minerals.
Well, Jim, thanks very much. And I do have a follow-up question for you, but first, just sort of, yes, sure, that's the through line across multiple administrations from a discursive point of view. This is what we've been saying. The through line from an actual what we do perspective seems to be, let's panic about it briefly until it's no longer in the headlines, and then do really absolutely nothing to increase, or to decrease China's, monopoly hold on processing. And maybe that'll change now, but who knows? But the question I really had for you, though, to follow up on the first part of your remark, does this amount to, I mean, as many Ukrainian friends of mine have told me, their real secret hope is that in a minerals agreement amounts to a security guarantee. If American interests are there on the ground in eastern parts of Ukraine, this amounts to a security guarantee. Is that implicit in the agreement?
It's a really good question, Kaiser, and I don't want to necessarily commit the administration to anything.
Oh, you haven't. You've caveated yourself safely out of this. So this is Jim Mullinax talking, not.
My own personal view is that we have a very strong interest, and the United States has a very strong interest in seeing a free and sovereign Ukraine, ideally with its original territorial borders. What it finally looks like, I don't know. I mean, that's up to the Ukrainians and presumably the Russians to work out in the end in a final peace agreement, which we all hope is coming soon. The U.S., in my view, the U.S. needs to be supporting Ukrainian sovereignty, and I'm very glad that the Trump administration has taken the steps to demonstrate that they want to have skin in the game. The vice president has said this. The president has said this. Having skin in the game is going to hopefully encourage the U.S. to stay the course in Ukraine, whatever that staying the course means, but to be invested long-term in Ukraine's sovereignty.
I hope you're right. I share your hope, but I certainly don't. I think he has said these things. He's also said many other things that would very, very much undermine.
Many things have been said.
Yes,
many things have been said.
All right. Well, let's leave it at that, and then turn to Greg for your closing remarks. And then finally to Qinduo.
Thanks a lot, Kaiser. I mean, first of all, I think if we zoom out from the situation right now, it's really about the change going from kind of a commitment to globalization, institutionalism, values-based approach towards a more security-minded, transactional-minded world. And I think this is exactly what we're seeing in the context of the CRM deal as well. And this is a new environment in a way for some of the actors, especially for the EU to navigate, something that the EU is learning quite rapidly, but it's not necessarily something that it was geared towards from the beginning. So I think what we have ahead of us in the context of the more challenging moment in the transatlantic relations is the fact that we need to have some tough conversations ahead of us, but ones that are hopefully going to be very productive and will find a new way for moving forward. In the context of what it means for EU-China relations at the same moment, there has been quite some momentum of engagement that supposedly the challenging moment in transatlantic relations opens this direction. A lot of the concerns that Europe has vis-a-vis China, whether that's the question of, again, China-Russia relationship, the question of overcapacity or overinvestment on the Chinese side, or indeed the question of our vision of the international order, all of those issues remain. And we have to keep the conversation going also with our Chinese partners. But it is not really a moment in which we're having a simple either or option on the European side. We're really in a situation where boosting and working on our strategic autonomy, understood again as addressing our vulnerabilities, is the way to go. And doing that whenever we can with partners, but keeping in mind the complexity that we're all venturing to.
Greg, thank you very much. It looks like we have lost Qinduo. That's Qinduo. I'm sorry. I was looking forward to responses from him. What I'm going to do instead is, there was one question that came in late, and I will throw this to Ivan and to Jim and to anyone who wants it. But this is from Vladimir Panchenko. What are the speaker's suggestions about the possibility to have investment into the Ukrainian economy, aside from just weapons? What are the plans for economic investment into Ukraine?
So, of course, weapons probably priority just because we're in war. As for non-weapon investment, I think that so could be because it might dependent on the way of rebuilding Ukraine, if it will be so-called the Marshall Plan 2.0, I mean, supporting of Ukraine like US support Europe after the end of the Second World War, just for giving a new momentum to world economy in that time. Now, after stresses, after COVID and after full-scale war in Russia, I think that new actually areas in economy can be opened. Of course, in Ukraine, it largely will close to food production, because even in time of war, Ukraine remained the main world exporter of sunflower oil and some other products. So I think that it could be investment in this area. Plus, we know that after first steps to reconstruct Ukraine, several European countries start to invest in separate regions in Ukraine. For example, we have a good dialogue between Mykolaievsky region and Denmark. Denmark now think about investment in this area, so it's probably new businesses that will be interesting to investors because they opening Ukraine for themselves. So quite possible that investment will be. Thank you for the question.
Great, and my stalling strategy worked, and we have Qinduo back on the call with us just in time to make his closing remarks before we bid everybody a good day. So, Mr. Xu, what are your thoughts on at the end of this fascinating hour and a half that we've spent?
Well, I would say, what we are seeing, the changes, the mineral resources agreement between Ukraine and the US, is the result of the change of the government in Washington. It's a change of the US policy. Jim has said that the US is committed to Ukraine. Obviously, it's not. And for Donald Trump, he's preferring a closer relationship with Russia rather than with European countries, rather than with Ukraine. Because of that change, Ukraine has to do something to make sure the U.S. will stay in the game. So that's why we have this mineral resources agreement, and also why Brussels and European countries are forced to be truly autonomy, to de-risk from Washington in terms of security over-dependence, in terms of, even ideologically, depending on Washington. So it's a good thing, maybe a long-term. But anyway, for short-term or medium term, probably we are seeing this kind of chaos, uncertainty in many respects.
Thank you. And just a reminder that Jim is a diplomat. And so, when he says something, I think he did a pretty good job of giving us a clear idea of what he actually meant in some of these circumstances. So, but thank you for your forthright comment. I think it's also very, very much appreciated. With that, I want to thank you all very, very much. To Ivan, fantastic. Really great to hear from you. To Jim, really great to see you again. Greg, fantastic to have you on. I look forward to speaking to you again. And Qinduo, just great to hear your perspectives from Beijing. All of you were excellent. So let's all thank Vita Golod for bringing us together in this. Thank you, Vita. Just a spectacular group of people you've helped lead and assemble.
Thank you, Vita. Yeah.
Thank you.